Call the Minister for Territories, Local Government and Major Projects.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The relevant movie I'd suggest is not Back to the Future but Groundhog Day, because we seem to consistently have the Shadow Minister having the chutzpah to stand up here being the man from the party which produced a car crash when it came to the NBN, and he's like the man at the car crash who is berating the emergency services when they turn up to fix it for not fixing it quickly enough. Let's be clear, the reason that the NBN presented a policy challenge to an incoming Abbott and now Turnbull government is because we inherited one of the most disastrous pieces of public policy execution in the history of the Commonwealth. Let's just remind ourselves of a few key facts to demonstrate the first proposition I want to articulate this afternoon, which was that Labor's NBN under the Rudd government was hopelessly mismanaged, hopelessly poorly planned. We had a sweeping but ill-conceived promise from Messrs Rudd, Conroy, Tanner and Swan in April 2009. It was going to be a 100 megabit per second network, and it was going to cost $43 billion. And apparently, according to the then Prime Minister, it was going to be such a great investment they were going to fund it through Aussie infrastructure bonds, and he urged mums and dads to go out and invest in these bonds, one of the most woefully inappropriate and negligent pieces of financial advice that has ever been given. We were told at the time that there was still going to be substantial private sector investment. We then, of course, had the implementation study commissioned from McKinsey and KPMG, who came back nearly a year later. Their report was released the Sunday before the budget, so with an attempt to disguise it from public scrutiny, and that report said there is no prospect of the private sector touching this with a barge pole, and it suddenly turned out that the Commonwealth was going to have to pay for the whole thing. And what did they achieve by the time they left government in September 2013, Mr Deputy Speaker? A woeful performance. After 4.5 years, how many Australians were in a position to connect to the NBN should they choose to do so? Barely over 300,000 premises after 4.5 years. So Labor flailed around in the most incompetent and disorganised fashion when it came to the NBN. There was virtually nobody on the board who had any experience of the telecommunications sector and private industry, and don't even ask the question of whether there was anybody in the Labor Party who had any experience of the private sector and the telecommunications industry, because that would be a futile quest. What we have had from Labor has been an incompetent execution, and of course the challenge for the incoming Minister for Communications, now the Prime Minister, was to turn that around and turn it into a credible, deliverable, executable, achievable plan, deliver on the rollout and start to get Australians connected to the NBN. And the then Minister for Communications, the current Prime Minister, has done a magnificent job in dealing with that challenge. I mentioned before that barely over 300,000 premises could be connected after 4.5 years. By the way, they'd managed to spend over $6 billion of public money during that period. There is nobody to compare to the Labor Party when it comes to vaporising public money at very rapid speed. What have we done in 2 years? The number of premises that can now connect is 1.32 million, nearly 4 times as many in 2 years after Labor got to the frankly pathetic number of just over 300,000 in 4.5 years. It really is, frankly, a mystery why they thought it was a good idea to even bring this issue up in an MPI debate today, Mr Speaker. And of course, we are not stopping at 1.2 million because there is an ambitious target of getting to 12 million premises which need to be able to connect. And we are quite frank and open with the Australian people about the scale of the challenge. On the opposite side of the chamber, they seem to think it's somehow curious that we should be honest and open with the Australian people that this is an extremely challenging infrastructure project. But it is, and we are seeking to be very open and transparent about that. Every week the rollout numbers are published on the company's website, something that we never saw from the previous government. Their principal interest in the NBN was in securing photo opportunities, and they certainly generated a lot of those, but substantial, tangible and measurable performance demonstrated in what was published on the company's website was nowhere to be seen. By contrast, we have announced last Friday a credible 3-year rollout plan under which by mid-2018 some 7.5 million premises around Australia will either be able to connect or will be in an area where construction has commenced. Now, that is a plan which has been developed by an experienced board, experienced management, and of course we very largely changed out both board and management to make sure we had capable, competent, experienced people, something bizarrely Labor never thought to do when they were in government, and we are getting on with the job of delivering the national broadband network. Let me make this critical point as I come to the third theme I want to mention this afternoon, which is the increasingly hysterical claims we are now getting from the Shadow Minister. We've got, for example, this hysterical claim that there's some kind of problem with the copper because NBN has purchased $14 million worth of copper from its supplier Prismium. Let me explain some basics about how a telecommunications network works. There are pillars along the street all around suburban Australia. We are going to install what are called nodes, and those are going to be near but not exactly next to the pillars. Therefore, there needs to be a copper connection from the pillar to the node. That is how a fibre-to-the-node network works. That is how a fibre-to-the-node network has always worked. You need to make sure there is a copper connection between the existing pillar and the new node. When you work out the many thousands of nodes around Australia that need to be connected to the many thousands of pillars, it turns out that's quite a bit of copper. And NBN is buying that copper as part of the ordinary job of delivering this network consistent with the plan that we have carefully developed and explained to the Australian people. But let's turn to the even more extraordinary and frankly ludicrous claim from the Shadow Minister that what we need to do is return to a plan under which NBN will be fibre all the way. His quote, October 14, "If you vote for the Labor Party at the next election, you will be voting for more fibre." What an interesting suggestion. And how has that been received by industry participants? What did the chief executive of one of the major telcos in Australia, M2, have to say about that? He said, quotes, "I think any further change in the deployment model would be ill-advised. I wouldn't advocate for any change." That's the industry, Mr Speaker. That's not politicians. That is industry participants in the telecommunications sector. What did the Australian Financial Review have to say about this brilliant new idea from the Shadow Minister? The Australian Financial Review had this to say, quote, "Labor has no credibility in this area. The NBN, as conceived under Rudd Labor, turned an important piece of national infrastructure, running to a sensible timetable, into a Kevin Rudd vanity project with no real idea of the costs that ran to a political schedule. It went from $4.7 billion in 2007 to $42 billion in 2009 to at least $56 billion today. A lack of considered detail bedevilled the NBN under Labor. The fact the party doesn't want to give any details about its new plan, or more accurately a reinstatement of the old NBN, and not talk about the cost, makes this policy look like the last and expensive joke." So it would seem that the new idea from the Shadow Minister about how Labor is going to deal with the NBN has not been well received by informed stakeholders. And the answer and the reason for that is pretty obvious, because while the Shadow Minister presumed to stand up and complain about the cost of the NBN that the coalition is now rolling out, he neglected to mention that the cause of that was the chaotic basis on which Labor first introduced the NBN, which we've been left to fix up. He also neglected to acknowledge the obvious point that his plan is going to cost at least $30 billion more. So if your objection is the cost of the plan, you now stand up and say, we are proposing to spend at least $30 billion more. That is clearly inconsistent.
Order.
And what about the fact, Mr Deputy Speaker, that his plan is going to take 6 to 8 years more to get the NBN rolled out to Australians? Mr Deputy
Order.
Speaker,
Member for Chifley.
the Turnbull government is getting on with the hard work of delivering an NBN. We don't say it's easy, but we've got a credible plan. What we have is deluded fantasy from the opposition.
Thank the honourable member.